Little did I know that the truth about Scott's sudden change of heart was about to be revealed in the most ridiculous way possible. The plot twist nobody saw coming, except everyone. The truth came out when my neighbor casually mentioned seeing Scott at my parents' house multiple times over the past few months. She thought it was sweet that he was still maintaining a relationship with his former in-laws and assumed we were all working through our divorce amicably. I stood there listening to her describe how often she had seen his car in their driveway, realizing that my ex-husband had basically moved in with my parents like some kind of twisted reverse adoption scenario. When I drove by their house later that week, Scott's car was parked in their driveway like he belonged there, which apparently he did now that I was no longer useful to any of them. I sat in my car across the street watching my ex-husband come out of my childhood home carrying a bag of groceries, acting like he was their actual son instead of the man who had abandoned their daughter during a medical crisis. The sight was so absurd that I almost laughed, except it was also the most betraying thing I had ever witnessed in my life. I called Scott immediately and demanded to know why he was living with my parents when he had supposedly needed space from our fertility issues and everything connected to our failed marriage. His explanation was even more pathetic than I expected, claiming that my parents had been supportive during our divorce and offered him a place to stay while he figured out his next steps. He acted like accepting their hospitality was perfectly normal behavior for a man who had just abandoned their daughter, rather than the most twisted living arrangement imaginable. The conversation got increasingly surreal when Scott started defending my parents and explaining how they had helped him realize that our marriage wasn't working. He said they had pointed out that he deserved someone who could give him children without years of medical interventions and uncertainty. He claimed they had shown him that staying with me would be settling for less than he wanted from life, and that leaving was actually the brave choice rather than the cowardly abandonment it obviously was. I could barely process what I was hearing because my own parents had apparently spent months convincing my husband that I wasn't good enough for him. The same people who had raised me and supposedly loved me had been actively sabotaging my marriage behind my back, telling my husband he could do better than their own daughter. They had identified my fertility issues as the perfect weapon to use against me and had systematically destroyed my relationship from the inside out. Scott kept talking about how my parents understood his desire for a traditional family and how they had supported his decision to prioritize his own happiness over staying in a marriage that couldn't meet his needs. He repeated their exact words about not wasting his prime. Years on someone who might never be able to have children, which confirmed that they had been coaching him through every step of our divorce. They had given him permission to abandon me and provided him with all the justifications he needed to feel good about his decision. The most ridiculous part was how Scott seemed to genuinely believe that my parents cared about his well-being more than their own daughter's happiness. He talked about them like they were wise mentors who had guided him toward a better life, rather than manipulative people who had chosen him over their own child. He couldn't see how twisted it was that they preferred having him as a surrogate son instead of supporting their actual daughter through a difficult time. My parents had apparently been playing puppet master with my marriage from the moment we announced our fertility struggles, using Scott's disappointment about our diagnosis to drive a wedge between us. They had positioned themselves as his allies against me, offering sympathy for his situation and validation for his doubts about our future together. They had made him feel like the victim in our fertility struggles, rather than recognizing that we were both dealing with an unfortunate medical situation. The manipulation was so calculated and cruel that it took my breath away. They had identified Scott's weakness, which was his inability to handle uncertainty and medical challenges, and had systematically exploited that weakness to destroy my marriage. It had given him an exit strategy that made him feel like the reasonable one for leaving, rather than the coward who was abandoning his wife during a crisis. Scott admitted that my parents had told him he was too good for me, and that he shouldn't sacrifice his dreams of a large family just because I couldn't provide children naturally. They had convinced him that staying with me would be unfair to both of us, since I deserved someone who could accept my limitations and he deserved someone who could meet his expectations. They had reframed his abandonment as a kindness to me, which was probably the most twisted logic I had ever heard. When I asked Scott if he realized how messed up this entire situation was, he got defensive and claimed that my parents had only wanted what was best for both of us. He couldn't see that parents who truly loved their daughter wouldn't have sabotaged her marriage and stolen her husband, regardless of any fertility issues or other challenges we were facing. He'd been so completely manipulated that he genuinely believed they had acted out of love rather than selfish desire to replace me with him. The realization that I had been systematically betrayed by every person who was supposed to love me unconditionally was devastating in ways I couldn't have imagined. My parents had used my medical condition as an excuse to destroy my marriage and steal my husband, proving that their love had always been conditional on my ability to serve their needs and desires. They had orchestrated the perfect plan to get rid of me while keeping the man they had always preferred, and they had convinced him that he was the victim in the entire situation. That phone call was the moment I realized these people were officially dead to me, and I was about to make that declaration in the most literal way possible.